My first video about myths and misconceptions got a lot more views than I expected, and since I already had enough things to talk about for part 2, here it is. This one will focus less on splitting hair kind of things like specific categorization, and more on bigger picture things. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, flappers. Okay, yes, flappers were definitely real, I'm not going to be a contrarian, but there are quite a few misconceptions about them. Flappers are one of the biggest symbols of the 1920s, along with jazz and prohibition, but the idea of flappers isn't really as simple as it's often boiled down to. And just a disclaimer, I'll mostly be talking about the US here. The term flapper was, and should still be treated as, a subjective term. It was often a label given by others rather than a completely unified identity. I don't think it can be classified as a subculture, but it was rather a cultural movement. And I would argue that we now overrepresent flappers in 1920s society. In 1922, one young woman named Ellen Wells Page wrote an article for The Outlook where she categorized flappers as part of a spectrum. First, there was semi-flapper, then there was flapper, then there was super flapper. Page herself loved to dance to jazz music and had bobbed hair, but she did not smoke or go to petting parties or use rouge or lipstick. It seems that in many people's modern definition of a flapper, Miss Page might not actually qualify. But Page was a prime example of what probably made up the majority of so-called flappers, what she termed semi-flappers. This is the category she put herself into. These were the women who wanted some degree of liberation, but were not simply reckless and hedonistic. At the time, members of the older generation might simply have seen a young woman with bobbed hair and immediately applied all of the stereotyped lifestyle choices of a super flapper to her. They too often didn't understand that there were different levels of flapper. And there were plenty of reasons why some women didn't become flappers or were semi-flappers. For one of these reasons, let's take a look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's short story titled Bernice Bobs Her Hair. In this story, Bernice is a young woman who wants to become more popular with boys, so she tells some boys that she will bob her hair, and they are intensely curious at this idea. However, her plan backfires, and her cousin's mother feels like she will cause a scandal for the family, and Bernice leaves town and goes back to her own hometown as a result. You might be thinking that such a cultural commentary from 1920 might not be too relevant in, say, 1925 and the fast-moving trendy culture of the 20s. And while flappers definitely increased in number after 1920 and the stigma lessened somewhat as the decade wore on, this sort of dilemma remained very real to many middle-class young women. Status was still important for middle-class families, and flappers were stereotyped as flirty, brainless, silly young women, not a good look for their older family members. Many young women idolized flapper icons like Colleen Moore, Clara Bow, and Joan Crawford, but there's a clear line between admiring something and actually doing it yourself. Think about it in slightly more modern terms. Did every big fan of Britney Spears want to go as far as she did? No, a majority of them did not cross that line. And I think Colleen Moore specifically is a good example of the image of a flapper versus actually being one, because she wasn't. She just played them on the screen because that's what really made her popular. She had the look, but was very different off-screen. Flappers permeated popular culture in the 1920s, even if they weren't as common as we make them out to be. There were so many young actresses who became flappers, or at least pretended to, and became very influential pop culture icons. Men wanted them, women wanted to be them, but in reality, potential problems prevented many normal women from taking that step. Flappers were often associated with sexual liberation, and because this was a period of changing views on women's roles, there was still a lot of tension there, especially with their parents' generation. And there were serious potential negative consequences to be considered, such as unwanted pregnancy and STDs. And we also have to recognize the fact that some women simply didn't want to be flappers due to personal preference. Some were content with the more traditional women's roles. The reason why flappers were so emphasized in the media at the time was because of what they represented. They represented a radical change from the norm. Young people often saw them as beautiful, sexy, fashionable, and independent. For many, it was simply a fantasy lifestyle they would never actually experience. This was why they took to the movie theaters and magazines instead. And it should also be noted that flappers were largely middle class. While the middle class certainly increased in the 1920s, the majority of people still would have fallen under the lower class or working class category. The women in these groups probably wouldn't have had the time or energy to take on a flapper lifestyle after working in a factory or caring for many children for almost every waking hour of their day. And we shouldn't forget immigrants either, who were usually in the lower or working class as well. The parents and relatives of young immigrant women would sometimes have been even more conservative than their American counterparts. The last thing those immigrant women would want is to be cut off from their family in a foreign country, and many of them didn't have that desire anyway. Many coming from more conservative cultures themselves, flappers would have seemed too much for them. And of course, I think it goes without saying that we shouldn't carelessly apply flappers to everywhere in the world. They spread to the United Kingdom, France, which was already a bit ahead of the curve, Germany, and to a lesser extent in Japan, for example. But there were plenty of places where they just weren't there. From our perspective now, we tend to latch on to more progressive features of previous time periods because we love to imagine how things that we find normal and are used to were so out there in the past. It's interesting that flappers were often derided and criticized in their time, and now we raise them on a pedestal. But the reality of flappers was somewhere in between. It was, and still is, difficult to definitively define a flapper, though we do have a general idea in our heads. Of course, there were some who went all in and did everything we associate with flappers, but many women incorporated some aspects of flapper culture, which might have even just been considered liberation, though they may not have actually considered themselves flappers. I think we can compare flappers of the 1920s to hippies of the 1960s. Many of the same things apply. There was a spectrum to hippies like there was with flappers. We have a stereotyped image of hippies in our heads: tie-dye shirt, long hair, drugs, and maybe some fringe. But not every hippie had all of those characteristics, and not everyone who adopted one or two of those characteristics was a hippie. And certainly not every young person in the late 1960s was a hippie, and in fact, they were a minority, but they stood out. Like Ellen Wells Page, the larger group of semi-flappers were just young women trying their best to find happiness and enjoyment without completely casting aside societal expectations like, say, the super flappers. Regardless of how you feel about flappers, they will always remain an iconic symbol of the 1920s. I just hope that more people will understand the nuance through this video. This is a good opportunity to bring up another point. I'm not actually sure how much of a misconception this is, but let's talk for a minute about bobbed hair in the 1920s. A bob simply means short hair that's even all around, but I think most people have a very specific image in their mind, probably the Louise Brooks style bob. But there were many, many variations of bobbed hair in the 1920s, perfectly illustrated by this handy-dandy picture guide from 1924. I am not an expert on fashion or hairstyles of any time period, but it seems to me that unless someone takes a slightly deep dive into it, they probably have a very narrow image of 1920s bobbed hair. So let's take a quick look at some famous 1920s women and their hairstyles to see some of the differences. I'll start off with my favorite, a big friend of the channel, the lovely Colleen Moore. From this magazine page, we can see that the style she has in this picture is the Dutch cut, or Dutch bob. Then we can go over to Louise Brooks, who is rocking a boyish bob. And in this photo, Clara Bow has what looks to me like a French side part bob. But those were only 3 of the 12 represented in this picture. I'm sure we could find at least one example of each style among 1920s Hollywood actresses. Taking a look at all of these together, we can see that only 4 of the styles feature straight hair, which I'd say is the stereotypical sort of bob. And many of the others featured waves, which were usually called Marcel waves and involved the process of marcelling. Like I said before, I don't know exactly how much of a misconception this really is, but I have a feeling that some people didn't know about the large variety of bobbed hair. Next is music. I don't mean to be a killjoy, but I have to say it. Jazz was not the most popular music of the 1920s. Of course, it's the most iconic and influential music from the decade, and it's the kind that we associate with it the most. And it did enjoy some popularity at the time, especially with younger people. But the fact of the matter is that sweet dance bands were more popular than jazz bands. I'm sure some viewers know this already, and those people will probably let me know in the comments, but people with a casual interest in the 1920s might not. In case you don't know what sweet dance music means, it was a type of music that continued in popularity into the 1930s, featuring slower rhythms, more melodies, and overall just nice, relaxing, and enjoyable music. Or it might also be considered very poppy jazz. Perhaps I should just play some samples to better demonstrate. This kind of poppy jazz as a category is pretty fluid and is known by a few different names, and some bands were certainly less sweet than others and were just called dance bands. But overall, the kind of music I'm referring to was just a less edgy version of the kind of hot jazz we usually consider when thinking about the 1920s. Arguably the most popular musician in the decade, at least in the US, was Paul Whiteman. At the time, Whiteman was dubbed the King of Jazz, and even today he's known for having employed the legendary jazz trumpeter Bix Beiderbecke. But despite these things, most of Whiteman's music doesn't really fall under the jazz category, and was essentially pop music, or sometimes more disparagingly described as watered-down jazz. Though in Whiteman's case, regardless of the category, it was cream-of-the-crop pop music. Paul Whiteman was more fluent in jazz than many other bandleaders in the dance band genre, but he stuck to a very popular music formula most of the time. Towards the end of the decade, he made a legendary contribution to the pop music genre by introducing the singer Bing Crosby to the world. And Bix Beiderbecke's inclusion in Whiteman's band gave the band some jazz credibility, while allowing Beiderbecke to explore pop music with a jazzy flair and diversify his repertoire. In Britain especially, this kind of sweet dance band music continued to be the most popular genre of recorded music well into the 1930s, though it was a bit different than the American kind. Whereas in America, at around the same time, swing music quickly began to spread around the country. As we all know, jazz was generally scorned by the older generation, as new forms of music always have been throughout the 20th century. But music in the mold of Paul Whiteman bridged the generational gap. Parents and children alike could enjoy the slow melody of 3 o'clock in the morning, as well as the classically influenced Oriental Foxtrot. While there were inevitably those of the younger set who were always looking for the fastest, craziest, hottest music to dance to, other younger people were perfectly happy to dance to the likes of Paul Whiteman, Isham Jones, Fred Waring, and Ben Burney. And in the same vein, the average person was far more likely to listen to a pop singer like Ruth Etting or Al Jolson than to now famous and influential singers like Bessie Smith or the scatted stylings of Louis Armstrong, even though both were pretty successful at that time, all things considered. And part of the reason for that, inevitably, was their race. In the same way that we often place flappers on pedestals for what many people now consider to be their progressive ways, musicians like Smith or Armstrong had the benefit of being musically progressive in their day and influential to future musicians. And this emphasizes the uniqueness of their style and recordings to us in the modern day. If we now listened to typical popular dance band recordings from the 1920s, they would most likely sound very generic to us, because honestly, most of them were generic. While Louis Armstrong's searing solos or the Duke Ellington Band's interesting use of tone would be much more interesting to listen to because they stand out from the others. For the thousands of small and large dance bands of the 1920s, those are just the breaks. They succeeded well enough in their day, but over time, their legacy has been overshadowed by those who thought more outside of the box. With the notable exception of Paul Whiteman, of course, because many of his recordings still hold up very well as a handful of other dance bands. Next, let's talk about a very broad topic. For many Americans, many of us have the impression that the 1920s were a peaceful and enjoyable time, and that might be true if you lived in select parts of the world. And Americans, myself included, are often tempted to go stay in their little middle-class 1920s bubble when they reflect on that time. But globally, the 1920s was one of the most politically chaotic and violent times in modern history. It was especially intense in the first 3 years of the decade. Of course, much of this was caused by the huge, long-lasting effects of World War I. Leaders were deposed, power vacuums were created, and the stakes had never been higher. The war had ripped Europe apart, so in many European countries there were violent outbursts even years after the war had ended. Some of the most well-known examples of this were in Germany. Then there was, of course, the Russian Revolution/Civil War, one of the most consequential events in human history. About 9 million people died as a result of that conflict alone. However, the worst of the fighting happened before the 1920s. Allied forces fighting against the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1920 consisted of British, American, French, and Japanese troops, as well as smaller numbers of troops from other European countries. It was almost like another world war in miniature. And even after the war ended, there were violent purges and warring factions. Between 1921 and 1922, Russia also experienced a massive famine, which killed 5 million people. The Soviet Union had also been heavily involved in a war with Poland since immediately after the end of World War I, which would only end in 1921, leaving more than 100,000 people dead. 1920 saw the end of the Mexican Revolution, but Mexico would then experience massive religious persecution during the Cristero War in the later years of the 1920s that would kill more than 200,000 people and made the same number of refugees, who mostly escaped to the US. The often overlooked Turkish War of Independence killed nearly as many people as the Mexican Revolution, but in less time. This fighting was a direct result of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the partition of Turkey from the Treaty of Versailles. Then there was also China, which had a kind of civil war of its own. More than 100,000 people died in those scattered battles. It brought some stability to part of the country, but not for long. China also experienced 2 major famines, one at the very beginning of the decade that killed about 500,000 people, and another at the very end of the decade that killed many millions and spilled over a bit into 1930. Another forgotten war was the Rif War, which pitted the small Republic of Rif in Morocco against Spain, who was assisted by France. This war killed about 30,000 people. There was more unrest and scattered fighting in the Middle East, not to mention America's involvement in the Caribbean, which also caused unrest there. There were also smaller engagements throughout the world, such as the Irish War of Independence and Civil War. While not nearly as deadly as the previously mentioned conflicts, it threatened the stability of one of the most powerful countries in the world, and many in the Western world watched its developments with alarm. There were a slew of other, smaller violent events, but I think you get my point. The good news is that most of the worst violence had decreased by the middle of the decade. Compared to all of this, America's position did seem pretty peaceful, but we can't let that color our vision for the decade as a whole throughout the world. And in America itself, of course, we can't forget about the usual suspect of discrimination and the fact that the KKK was at its peak of power in 1924. There was racial violence in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in Florida. Lynching also saw a bit of a resurgence in the early 1920s. Allegedly, it was Italian anarchists who bombed Wall Street and killed 40 people. The 1920s opened just as the Red Scare had terrified many about a secret invasion of violent foreign terrorists. During Prohibition, gangsters murdered each other in alleys, and the US government poisoned alcohol, which led to thousands of deaths. And that last one isn't just a crackpot conspiracy theory. And if you were a farmer in the US, the 1920s would not have been very pleasant for you. First, there was an economic depression from 1920 to 1921 that hit farmers hard, and throughout the entire decade, farmers continued to struggle. This wasn't usually deadly, but wasn't likely to put you in a dancing mood either. As I've said a few times before, the 1920s is one of the time periods that many Americans especially revere as a golden age. One of the goals of this channel is to present the nuance of the 1920s. Most of those fun things we all enjoy about the decade did happen and did exist, but unsurprisingly, there were also plenty of bad things and everything else in between. So I hope this brief summary shows a little bit more about the true 1920s rather than just an idealized version. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I know the segments in part 1 were a lot more nitpicky, so I hope this video satisfied those looking for some more general things. If you have a suggestion for something else to include in a future installment of this series, let me know in the comments and I might cover it later on. I have a couple of other ideas, but not enough for another video yet. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.